Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the conference for Human Capital Watch. I'm Amy Yi. I'm the Human Capital Research Associate with the conference board. I'm today's moderator of the webcast, and also I have two guest speakers with me today, Robyn Erickson and Marian Devine, whom I will introduce in a bit. We are very excited to be here to discuss with you this important topic, talent mobility. So before we get started, I'd like to mention a few housekeeping items to help you better participate in today's webcast. So first of all, the presentation is available for download via the file download pod on your screen. And we like to make today's webcast interactive. So if you have any questions or comments, please type them in the chat box anytime during the webcast. We'll try to weave some of them into our discussions. We will also leave some time at the end to address your questions. In any case, we're not able to address all of your questions, please contact us and we will try to follow up with you. To help us improve our future webcasts, please complete a brief evaluation at the end of the webcast to help us understand what went well, what could we improve in the future, and any comments you have about today's topic and the webcast. And last but not least, if you like to watch the recordings, please know that the recordings will be available 48 hours after today's webcast on demand. So what are some critical questions and issues we'll be answering today? As Robyn, Marian, and I were doing the research, we noticed that there is a shifting of view of how people perceive talent mobility. So we will spend some time talking about what's the shifting view of talent mobility. And in our research, we identified the top 10 strategic purposes of talent mobility. So what are the top 10 strategic purposes? And also, what are some barriers that prevent companies from achieving the success of talent mobility? And last but not least, what organizations can do to alleviate some of the challenges in order to deliver an effective talent mobility program. So for those of you who are earning credits, please note that you have to stay online for the entire hour, as the credits are only available for live participation. We offer 3 types of credits, including CPE, HRCI, and SHRM. Please make sure to type your full name, email address, and specify which credits you are taking in the space provided. And click OK for 3 pop-ups that occur during the program. So now I'd like to introduce my 2 guest speakers who will also co-present with me and also are the co-authors of the talent mobility research. The first is Robyn Erickson. So Robyn is based in Chicago. She is a principal researcher in the human capital practice and leads the Employee Engagement Institute at the conference board. Welcome, Robyn. And next guest speaker is Marian Devine. Marian is from UK. She is a senior researcher in human capital at the conference board for Europe, and she is a co-leader for the Europe Employee Engagement Experience Council. Glad to have you, Marian. So I'm Amy Yi. Again, I'm a research associate in human capital, and I conduct research in employee engagement, leadership development, and talent management. So why is talent mobility important? According to our research, we found that talent mobility can help organizations address a lot of talent issues related to talent attraction, retention, and engagement. So for those of you who are familiar with the conference board research, we do an annual survey called the C-Suite Challenge Survey, asking global CEOs and C-suite leaders about their challenges and priorities in their business and industries. So according to our latest research from 2019, so 2 of the top 3 issues on CEOs' minds revolve around talent. So as you can see from the table on the screen, attraction and retention of top talent was ranked #1 overall. It was ranked #1 by all the regions and countries listed on the screen as well. It shows that there's a consistent view of how CEOs perceive the talent issues. Another issue related to talent is developing next generation leaders, and it was ranked #3 overall by CEOs. And in the same study, we asked the follow-up questions. To develop your future leaders, what are the top 3 investments global C-suite leaders would like to make? As you can see from the screen, promoting cross-functional rotation experiences, which we will discuss later, that is an important approach to talent mobility, was ranked #1 by HR leaders and #2 by global CEOs. And succession management, which is also an important area related to telemobility, also made the list for both CEOs and HR executives. And we also find that telemobility is positively associated with business performance. In one study, we found that high-performing organizations are 2 times more likely to prioritize telemobility and 4.5 times more likely to articulate a specific criteria for mobility. So that's why we like to focus on telemobility. And in our study, we like to focus on the strategic purposes of telemobility. So in the full report, we identify the top 10 strategic purposes, the primary barriers, as well as some best practices organizations can take to address those barriers. And we're not able to cover every single finding in today's 1-hour webcast. But if you're interested in today's topic, please, we encourage you to read the full report afterwards. We also create a summary table to help you guide through the process. And the report was released in April this year. So in terms of a research methodology, we utilized a multi-method approach to collect data. So we did some literature review, and we spoke to 7 subject matter experts to understand this topic. And they help us to narrow the research focus as well. Additionally, we conducted a global web survey, and we received 121 responses from HR leaders across the world. We asked questions about their strategic purpose of telemobility, the barriers they encountered while implementing the telemobility programs, as well as their overall effectiveness of the telemobility strategy. So among the 121 responses, 57% were from Americas, 25% were from Asia, and 16% were from Europe. So to help us understand better what organizations are doing in terms of telemobility strategy, as well as initiatives, we also spoke to 10 companies, 10 HR leaders to have a better understanding of their unique practices in telemobility. Last but not least, we conducted 2 focus groups with HR leaders to discuss the drivers and the challenges of telemobility. So this is a quick overview of our research methodology. And without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to my colleague Marian to discussing the shifting view of telemobility.
Great, thank you, Amy. That's great. Yeah, I think I'd like to share with our viewers today that what we saw in our research is that 2 quite separate models are developing for telemobility, and we don't think that these 2 separate programs connect. So traditionally, you have organizations that focus on talent management programs that really focus very much on a small cohort of high potential employees or future senior leaders. So mobility here is a lever to accelerate their development. And that trajectory is vertical, and it tends to be a well-defined career path, and it tends to be aimed at promotion into key roles. And so really in that sort of model, mobility is pretty much understood as geographical mobility. It's all about exposing these high flyers to different markets and cultures, or to maybe move them into important corporate hubs across the global enterprise. But we saw in our research a different model is emerging, and that's where companies are beginning to focus on internal mobility. And it is quite different because it's inclusive, so it's not for a small number of talents. It's for internal employees. It often involves sideways movement. It's not necessarily vertical. And there's a strong emphasis on using mobility as a tool of engagement and retention, as well as ensuring that employees are developing the right skills and being moved to positions that they can enjoy and they can generate value for the business. So I think, Amy, now we're going to have a quick poll just to find out a little bit about where our viewers are coming from. So to you, Amy.
Thanks, Marian. So we will have our first polling question. So the question is, how effective is your telemobility program in your organization? And we have 5 options on a 5-point Likert scale from very effective to not at all effective. We'll leave the poll open for 30 seconds.
Robyn, I just wondered, which response do you think that most of our audience will pick today, and why?
So I suspect that the majority of the audience will not rank their talent mobility programs very high, simply because I think that what we found in many of our interviews was that organizations struggle with talent mobility. And oftentimes, as you were saying, the internal mobility is separate from the global mobility. So anyway, so it'll be interesting to see what we find.
It will be.
Thanks. We will give our audience 3 more seconds to respond. 3, 2, 1. Okay, we'll close the poll, and I think most respondents respond with slightly effective, with 40%, over 40%.
Okay, well, I think that's an interesting finding, Amy, because I think, as Robyn says, it does show that an awful lot of people in companies out there are not satisfied with talent mobility, and they don't think it's working. And you can see in the next slide that that's what our survey also very much showed. Perhaps it's slightly more effective than our audience today, but only 28% believe that their talent mobility programs are effective or very effective.
I'd like my colleagues to move to the next slide, if possible.
Thank you. Yeah, so as you can see, that's the results of our own survey, and I think we were surprised. I mean, I know I was, to find that only 28% believe that their talent mobility programs are effective or very effective. So to us, that really said that current approaches really aren't keeping pace with the strategic needs of businesses, and that businesses have some complex needs in a very difficult and disruptive environment, and they're not being met at the moment. So looking at the next slide, I think that our research suggests that companies need an approach to talent mobility that is helping them deal with 3 quite complex but interconnected trends. And you can see in this slide that on the one hand we are seeing new business models emerging, and we're seeing that companies which are immersed in all sorts of different kinds of business transformation are looking at new models. They're reinventing themselves to deal with new customer needs. They need to be more innovative. They're dealing with all this new digital technology. And there's very much a trend towards going to flatter, more network structures. So where do vertical, well-defined career paths fit in this new world? They are less and less reality, really. And in one career, an individual may find themselves working in cross-functional, or an agile team, or an innovation lab, or they might be seconded to a joint venture partner. So that's one trend. The second trend is new ways of working, and this is very, very closely linked, but geared to getting products and services ever faster to the marketplace. And this is multidisciplinary collaboration and team working, making much more use of a wide range of technology and AI-based tools. And we are now in a world where 50% of your current job may change over the next 5 years. And you will have to be able to rapidly learn and develop new skills. And the third one is segmented employee value propositions, which is a bit of a mouthful, but really what we mean is in a world where talent is increasingly scarce, you have 5 generations in the marketplace. Your workforce is increasingly diverse. Companies really have to understand what it is that helps motivate their employees, what helps engage them, what helps retain them, and then provide some quite personalised and tailored work experiences. So those are the 3 interconnected trends that we're seeing. So moving on to the next slide, we believe that if companies are going to successfully respond to these trends, they do have to work in a different way with talent mobility. They have to develop and deploy their workers to work in different organisation structures, learn different skills, often really quickly, and provide them with engaging work experience. And this is going to require a much more adaptive and dynamic model of talent mobility. So we're seeing the emergence of an approach that is much more expansive, and we think that talent mobility is becoming multi-directional. It's vertical and lateral, and it might be even downwards, for example, to change career direction or in the run-up to retirement. It's internal movement, a movement to other geographies, and this could be across the business and even into other organisations like a key supplier. And it's also not just employees, but also contingent workers like contractors, who we know form an increasingly important part of any modern workforce. So we call this total talent mobility, and we believe this model is much more aligned to the realities of today's and, more importantly, tomorrow's workplace. So moving on to the next slide, in our report we offer a definition of what we're seeing, which is total talent mobility. We believe this is a critical component of a talent management strategy, and we're defining it as a practice of moving workers in response to their aspirations and or business needs, and hopefully those two are balanced. And it can be either temporary or permanent. The movement can be across skill sets, occupations, functions, and or geographies, and it usually occurs within the organisation, but short-term moves can also be across organisations or even industries. So Amy, that's where we landed in our research and in our understanding of how we think that the talent mobility landscape is changing.
Thank you, Marian, for introducing the total talent mobility concept. So in our report, we actually have created a framework for total talent mobility according to each of the purposes. And my colleague Robyn will be sharing with us the top 10 strategic purposes and some barriers for each of the purpose. But before that, let's go to our second polling question. So the second question is, in your perspective, what's the top strategic purpose of talent mobility in your organization? Again, we have 5 options. The first is engage and retain talent. Second, foster collaboration and innovation. Third, develop high potentials and leadership succession planning. Number 4, enable skills and competency development. And number 5, build agility in leaders and the workforce. So I see the results are coming, and while our audience is answering the question, so Robyn, could you briefly tell us why we decided to focus on this topic, the strategic purpose of talent mobility?
Sure, Amy. I'm happy to share. And this was a relatively new topic for us here at the conference board, and we thought that we should start by doing some subject matter interviews first. So as Amy mentioned, we did a number of those. And what kept coming out was that talent mobility could be used for many different strategic purposes within an organization. I've actually seen an article that calls talent mobility the panacea for all talent issues. Not sure it's the panacea for all of them, but definitely for some. And we also wanted to make sure that the research we were doing didn't duplicate research that had already been published. So that's why we chose this.
Thanks, Robyn. I'll give audience 2 more seconds to respond to this question. 2, 1, close the poll. Okay, so the results are very interesting, and dominantly developing high potentials and leadership succession planning is a top strategic purpose for most of our audiences. So let's go to the next slide. And Robyn, you can. Yeah.
Thank you. Perfect, Amy. Thank you. And so you'll see there that our number 1 strategic purpose for total talent mobility is to develop high potentials and leadership succession planning. So that's exactly in line with the results we just saw, where over 50% of you picked that one. However, the interesting thing is that the responses to the other 4 choices that we gave you were somewhat mixed. And so that's what we found. That they're definitely developing high potentials and leadership succession planning was number 1. Number 2 was to build business leaders with broad, diverse experience. Number 3 was to enable skills and competency development. 4, engage and retain talent. I think that is something that's happened in the last few years. And so with our tight labor market, and so definitely not surprised to see that in the top 5. And then develop leaders to grow the business in new areas. If you go to the next slide, you'll see the second set. First one being swiftly transfer skills and expertise across geographies. Clearly that's very related to global mobility. 7, though, and 8, I think that organizations may not have thought about fostering collaboration and innovation and building agility in leaders in the workforce. Obviously, number 9, ensure knowledge transfer and cross-pollination of ideas. And then number 10 was decrease time to fill new roles. And I was actually surprised at that response, simply because I have a background in talent acquisition research, and talent mobility is within an organization, moving hires around is a great way to fill open roles and to allow your employees to feel as though that they have a career path in the organization and be more likely to stay. So I was surprised to see that one came last, but maybe in the future it will come up higher after we convince everyone that total talent mobility is the answer to many of your talent challenges. So if you go to the next slide,
Okay.
We actually have another poll.
So this is our last polling questions in today's webcast. And the question is, in your organization, what is the biggest barrier to delivering an effective talent mobility program? The first one is difficulty of designing and implementing an integrated end-to-end talent mobility process. The second is inability to align employee demand with internal mobility opportunities. The third is leaders are unwilling to let high-performing talent move from their team. The fourth is lack of employee willingness to move geographically. And fifth is difficulty of anticipating the future talent needs of the business. So we will leave the poll open for 30 seconds.
And while we're waiting for you to respond to this, Marian, do you think that our audience is going to have a hard time picking from these?
Yes, I think they will, Robyn, because I think that probably many organisations are encountering multiple barriers. I see that one of our viewers has already said that he thinks it's to do with managers being unwilling to let their talent move from their team, and that's to do with specialist skills. But I'm going to put my betting on lack of willingness among employees to move geographically. So it'll be really interesting to see what our audience pick.
Definitely. So, Amy, what were our results?
Okay, so let's close the poll now. The top is difficulty of designing and implementing integrated end-to-end talent mobility process. 23 participants had that answer.
Perfect. That's 46%. So, and then the spread is pretty close for the others. So that doesn't actually surprise me. I actually think that the difficulty of designing and implementing integrated end-to-end talent mobility processes is one of the highest challenges for HR, and we'll talk a little bit about that. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that we actually had all of our participants rank order their top barrier. And so you can see there that the number one in our survey that we found was the lack of employee willingness to move geographically. But number two was the one that Marian had mentioned around talent hoarding, that leaders are unwilling to let high-performing talent move from their team. You can see there number three is the difficulty of designing and implementing integrated end-to-end talent mobility processes. So not surprised to see that response from this group. And actually, I think that the folks who attended this may have been concerned about the difficulty of aligning processes and looking for some advice on that. So that actually makes perfect sense. Thank you for being here with us today to learn about this. I'm not going to go through all the other ones. You can see the cost of talent mobility programs is high, that the culture doesn't support employee mobility, similar to number two around leaders not being willing to let high-performing talent move from their team. I've actually heard some horror stories where people have said things like, it's easier to get a different job within an organization if I quit and then apply separately, or that recruiters will be searching for candidates and they'll find their best candidate on a social networking site, find out that they work for the organization, but they're not allowed to reach out to them proactively simply because organizations don't want that idea of talent poaching. So anyway, clearly there are a lot of barriers. Again, another one just worth mentioning is that employees don't feel that there's any sort of a reward or enough reward for taking on the risk of a new position. So definitely take a look at these barriers in more detail later. Take a look at the report. The good news is that we have actually spent some time thinking about the top 10 strategic purposes, the barriers that most impact those things, and then what are some best practices for each of those. And so actually, there is some overlap, as is apparent, the culture doesn't support it because, and number two, the leaders are unwilling to let high-performing talent move. So we do realize there's some overlap, but we've picked the best practices that we think are most relevant and the barriers that we think are most relevant for each strategic purpose. So with that, if you go to the next slide, we are going to go through, for the sake of time, only 5 of our best practices. So if you want to learn the others, you'll have to take a look at the report. But the first one we wanted to mention, obviously, is the one that came up first here and also then first in our report, which was to the top strategic purpose around developing high potentials in leadership succession planning. What's really interesting about this is that many organizations are already doing this, and our view, as Marian had mentioned before, that talent mobility, total talent mobility, is not just for high potentials and to develop leaders. And so thinking about what organizations can do to make mobility available to all their employees. So first thing, if you haven't done it already, the first best practice is to build talent mobility into your high potential leadership development strategy. I actually have a statistic here that says that in some other research that the conference board did, only 16% of organizations offer mobility opportunities. So there's clearly not enough. But all generations find career mobility, talent mobility as one of their top reasons to stay in an organization. So if you're concerned about retention of your high potentials or all of your employees, definitely think about that. Second, the next best practice is hold leaders accountable with incentives or performance expectations. Unfortunately, what gets measured is often what matters. And so if you're not measuring the number of talent moves within your organization, then you're not going to be able to make sure that it's going to happen. So basically, you need to hold leaders accountable with either the carrot of incentives or the stick of performance expectations. At the very least, you need to have them be reporting the number of internal moves. And one of the organizations we interviewed said that in their organization, internal mobility is so important that if a leader gets a reputation for not helping his or her employees move around, people won't want to join their team in the future. So definitely something to be thinking about. The third best practice is all around closing the pay gap. So the issue here is that most employees know that they can get 15% more to go across the street to another competitor. However, when you get promoted internally, oftentimes organizations think, oh great, we don't have to pay more for this position. We can just throw a couple $1,000s to this employee who's moving into the new role, or make them consider it a lateral move. The problem with that is that some research for you shows that external hires are initially paid 18% more than employees who move internally. And so your employees who are driven by the fact that they want the highest wages possible, they're going to quickly figure out that if they move within the same organization, they won't have that same opportunity in terms to increase their pay. So it's important to think about salary compression and make sure to equal those out. Obviously, the big barrier here, you see our intrepid mountain climber trying to climb the mountain, and has the big barrier of leaders unwilling to let high-performing talent move from their team. In our interviews, most of the people we interviewed said that very sheepishly that they have a culture of talent hoarding. Another study found that over 73% of low-performing organizations actually found that talent hoarding was their leading obstacle to talent mobility. So definitely something to be thinking about. And go to the next slide, our next barrier. You can see here we picked that we wanted to talk about engage and retain talent. And so this is definitely a strategic purpose in our very tight labor market currently. I'm actually working with our labor markets team on figuring out what those recruiting and retention solutions are for organizations. But when it comes to total talent mobility, the biggest barrier, you see the big barrier there, is the difficulty of designing and implementing integrated end-to-end talent mobility processes. This was your number one barrier. So you guys will be nodding your heads and agreeing with this. I think that it's really important for organizations to attack total talent mobility from an integrated perspective, as Marian was saying. So the first thing they should be doing is to leverage cloud and AI-based tools. It's really important that everyone within HR has the same data, that there's a platform that tracks people's movements and their performance management and whether or not organizations can retain them. Retention is actually a really big issue with employees who move positions geographically for global mobility, and I'm not sure, I haven't seen any research on the percentage of internal moves who stay in the same organization, but it definitely keeps them there longer. When we did some research, we found that the average length of time that an employee stays in an organization is 4.2 years. However, for employees ages 25 to 34, that's only 2.7 years. So if you think about it, basically they take the younger generation comes on board, takes a year for them to learn their jobs, a year for them to do it correctly, and then another 6 or 7 months to find a job. So why should they be looking externally? It's really important that they know what options are available to them. You can engage them. So there's the leveraging the cloud and AI-based tools. There are chatbots specifically for mobility. There's also platforms that allow all employees within HR to have access to the same data. The second one is to provide dedicated HR support. And actually, I would take that one step farther and just say, create a total talent mobility team. One of the organizations we interviewed had created what they called a talent brokerage team with members from all different parts of their talent and HR function. And they got together once a month to discuss, who was being moved around, who was available to be moved around, who wanted to move around, who had moved around, what they might need. So it's really important that your organization has a high-level view of what's going on with total talent mobility. The third best practice here is to define success early and provide continuous feedback. And that's from the perspective of oftentimes employees, as I said, they don't feel like they're rewarded enough to go to take a new job. So it's important for them to know what success would look like and to provide continuous feedback to them with their new manager, and making sure that if they're planning to go back to their old role, that the new manager communicates with the old manager, simply just to make sure that everybody sort of knows how this employee has grown and developed during that position. So if you go to the next slide, the third best practice I'm going to share with you is to enable skills and competency development. And it's really important here because we found some research that actually scared us a little bit. Specifically, sorry, just going to my notes here. Specifically, the World Economic Forum found that the global average for skills stability is 58%, which means that 42% of your workers' skills will no longer be relevant in 4 years. So that's pretty frightening if you think about it, that only a little bit over half of an employee's skills will actually be relevant in the future. So the barrier we picked for this one was the difficulty of anticipating future talent needs of the business, the concept that organizations need to know in the future what talent needs they're going to need, especially with the influx of so much artificial intelligence. It's going to be changing the future talent needs of the business. And so we're going to need new skills. And I don't think we're going to need fewer workers, but I think our workers are going to need new skills. So the first best practice is to link your workforce planning with talent mobility to make sure that there's a clear connection between those two groups, and looking at your internal talent as a way to think about the reskilling that you need to do and the competency development. The second best practice is to ensure multi-skill development in one assignment. It turns out that learning just one skill at a time is not efficient or economical, and so it's important that folks think about what skills are you expecting your employees that are taking these positions to move. And in fact, one other statistic that I thought you might find interesting is that the shelf life of technical skills is only 12 to 18 months. So I mentioned that 58% of an employee's skills overall wouldn't be are going to be relevant in 4 years, or 40% won't be. But the shelf life of the STEM issues, the IT issues, skills rather, are only going to work for the next 12 to 18 months. So it's important that you're thinking about how are you going to reskill folks, and then creating a failure-tolerant culture by creating stretch assignments. And one of the HR leaders that we interviewed said, not everyone's going to be successful in the new role, so it's important that we allow them to fail quickly if that's what's going to happen. So, basically saying, hey, we're going to reward you for taking on a stretch assignment. If it's not the right fit, then, no harm, no foul, and we're going to continue to value you as an employee in our organization. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Marian to go through the last two best practices that we'll discuss with you today.
Great, thank you, Robyn. Yeah, so if we move to the next strategic purpose, and this is to build agility in leaders and the workforce. And it's interesting, actually, that when you did the poll, you didn't really rate this particularly highly, but I think it's something that we're going to see more and more. And it's certainly something that we're seeing within our organisation, the conference board and the councils that I go to. Companies are really talking about how do they build agility. And we define that as the strategic capacity to identify and act on new customer needs. And this is all about quickly pivoting for opportunities and risks and launching new business models. So it's the ability to really respond quickly to a very disruptive environment. So what is the barrier here? Well, the barrier here is that this requires an enormous amount of insight and knowledge about the needs of the business, insights and knowledge about your employees and how you might be able to move them and the skills they need, etc., etc. And basically, it needs a capability in HR technology and data analytics to match those two very complex sets of needs, the business needs and employee skills and wishes. And we know from various pieces of research that we've done, not least 2 reports on the GDPR, that HR data, there is a revolution going on, but actually companies are really struggling. HR data is still spread across many disconnected systems, and it is a barrier to workforce planning, and it often prevents employees from moving flexibly across diverse projects and teams because it's just so hard to track them. So what are some of the best practices? Well, we do know that a lot of our members are certainly making considerable investments into technology. And so, but for what reason? And the reason is to match employees with opportunities and to really use rich data to match them together. So in one of the companies that we spoke to, an international bank, they have introduced a digital platform for their 200,000 employees who work in 70 countries. Now, you can just imagine how complex it must be to move people around in this very flexible way to really promote agility. And so this platform is really acting as like a transparent internal job market, and it provides access to every employee profile. So if they choose, because again of the requirements of GDPR, if they choose, employees can provide a real wealth of information about their skills, what motivates them, what they enjoy, their aspirations, their willingness to be moved geographically, and maybe just stuff about themselves even outside the organisation, maybe leadership positions, or maybe they work for charities, but just a really rich profile of who they are. And this platform is linked to a tool that provides information about internal opportunities, and it pushes potentially suitable jobs. And those jobs can be in the same part of the organisation, or the tool will actually say, there's another employee with a similar profile and they're working in a very different part of the organisation. Have you considered this? So that's one very exciting possibility really for companies. Second good practice is taxonomies, and this is really very much coming from the world of Agile. And again, if you're going to move to very agile, small teams, if you are going to adopt true agility and have squads and all these sort of 2-week projects, then you really have to understand what your teams are and where they are and who's in them. So one US financial services company has developed such a taxonomy because they had at least 500 agile teams in 2018, and they developed this for its business units. And so this allows their product line leaders to assemble cross-functional teams with minimal confusion, minimize redundancy, duplication across the teams, and just make sure that it's working in a very, very efficient and strategic way. And the third best practice here really is that if you're going to move to this more agile way, and if you're going to have your employees moving around, then you do have to think about your team leaders, supervisors, traditional line managers, team leaders. They need to work in new ways to support these employees who are working across so many different projects and teams. And this is about kind of having a different conversation, a different way as well of performance management really, but it's understanding their own employees' priorities and goals. It is the need to provide frequent feedback to help them just keep learning, and it's to align their career aspirations with the business needs and of course with their learning development plans. So that's quite a different set of skills for managers and supervisors, and they will need help in that. So moving into the next slide, I thought it would be we thought it would be good to also talk a little bit about collaboration and innovation. And again, you may not have thought about the fact that talent mobility can really help in these areas. And there is a storm of digital transformation going on, and we think that total talent mobility can be a really important lever here, helping to expose employees to new perspectives and to learn and adapt. And a lot of the exciting work that we're doing in neuroscience shows that to learn, the brain really needs the stimulation of fresh experiences. But the big barrier is a culture that just doesn't support mobility. It might be that internal hiring and internal movement are just not strategic priorities. Managers don't view them, don't view themselves as importers and exporters of talent. They don't think it's fundamental to their responsibilities. They might even think it detracts from their own success and the success of their team. And you might have a local culture that's really not conducive to, say, innovation. And it might well be that you have to move people around and transfer them maybe to a unit or a department where it is easier to experiment and to collaborate and to just draw on a wider support of people and capabilities. So some of the best practices that we saw in this area was really embedding talent mobility into company-wide principles and activities. And so one company that we spoke to, in 2016 to 2017, they introduced 7 mobility principles. So they decided that to change their culture, they really needed to articulate what were their mobility principles. They were quite simple, but it was directives such as not discriminating in any way when it came to moving people around, and really thinking about diversity when they were moving people, and publishing all vacancies on the organisation's online mobility programme. Another good practice is to create programs that really help people think about working in different locations or different types of organisations. So one airliner in Oceania invited employees actually from other firms in the same industry to work in its digital, finance and HR departments, just for a short time, but just to really facilitate an exchange of learning and development between those companies. And then another thing to consider, and we know a lot of our members are doing this, is thinking about innovation labs. So just recently, a global telecom has piloted an entrepreneur studio for its French staff. And what happens here is that successful applicants pitch their ideas before a cross-functional jury. They gain sponsorship from the business unit, and then they work full-time on the project for about 6 to 18 months. And that must be pretty exciting, working on your own project. They get a budget, they get an entrepreneur coach, and they they get help from specialists such as coders and designers. So they piloted that, and they felt that it's gone so well that they're now going to roll it out to their European and African operations. So that's some of what we thought was perhaps some of the more interesting things to talk to you around. Really think widely about and expansively about how talent mobility might help you and your company achieve some very important strategic purposes. So moving on, where have we landed? What's sort of our conclusion on all this this research that we've done? And I think that what we feel is that really total talent mobility is a flexible tool for a very flexible world. And we think that flexibility is really coming in 5 dimensions. So if you look at the next slide, there are 5 dimensions are directional. So this sort of new, much more flexible model is multi-directional. So it could be vertical, but it's also geared up to be lateral in its movement, moving people sideways, moving people maybe even downwards if that's appropriate. For example, some of the companies that we studied last year when we looked at employing mobile workers and really tapping into their skills, sometimes in that run up to retirement, sometimes people move down a post to free them up to do coaching and mentoring, which they find very satisfying and which young workers really benefit from. So there is this multi-directional element to total talent mobility. Cross-entity. If you're going to go to all this trouble, why not really think beyond organisational boundaries? So this movement is inwards for your contingent workers to move them around your organisation, but also outwards. If you have talented employees or employees who really need to learn some difficult skills, to operate in a completely different way, send them to a strategic partner, such as a key supplier, or on a local contract in a foreign subsidiary, but just sort of think cross-entity. Another flexibility, a source of flexibility is durational. It's very easy to think of mobility as either just very temporary or permanent, but we think that actually total talent mobility is about really placing equal emphasis on both permanent and temporary movement. And that's certainly what we're seeing in some of the companies that we spoke to, that actually they were thinking about, it could be only a few weeks, it could be 18 months, but certainly by being quite flexible about the time span of the experience, it could help sometimes encourage, say, millennials who were reluctant to really go perhaps outside Europe. And then the final sort of flexible dimension is ownership and stakeholder ownership. So if you're working under this new model, mobility you just can't have it segregated between different stakeholders who just look at their bit. So for example, procurement just concentrating on contingent workers, talent acquisition just concentrating on recruiting, talent management really just thinking about sort of internal people, especially high flyers or developing leaders, and very much succession planning, looking just at the very top cohorts of leaders. So ownership has to be wider, and it really has to be a coalition across your enterprise, and that means close partnership, joined up thinking with leaders from the business, very important, and also other key players like your strategic workforce planners, your data analytics people, your learning and development people, and I think also people who are really have a lot of expertise in employee engagement and diversity and inclusion. So again, you're making sure that you're really making use of your very diverse workforce. And then holistic and end-to-end. Total talent mobility needs your multiple stakeholders to get together and devise an integrated end-to-end process. Because again, this is difficult, it can be costly, and if you're going to get the very best out of it, then you need to have this end-to-end perspective, and you have to make sure that you're getting the optimal alignment between the needs of the business and also what you're trying to achieve with your individual workers in terms of engaging and retaining them and skilling them. So this end-to-end perspective is really, really important. So I think, Robyn, you're now going to share with our participants some practical recommendations that we've made, drawing from our research.
Thank you, Marian, and thank you for going through the new approach that we think that organizations should be thinking about total talent mobility in a much broader perspective with those 5 dimensions. So we did get a request to post the actual article since we only went through 5 of the strategic purposes. So we put in the chat a link to the report so you can download it. Also like to encourage you to send us any questions you have, and we'll address those in just a few minutes. So in terms of overall recommendations, we felt like we were giving a lot of advice, so we wanted to create just a small number of suggestions for organizations. And the first one goes with the biggest barrier that you found, which is to create an integrated approach to total talent mobility, including both global and internal mobility. And then, starting to think about all of those processes that go together with that. The second recommendation is to focus on all employees, not just the high potentials, to strengthen overall employee experience and decrease attrition, especially given the fact that as voluntary turnover here in the U.S. goes down, as unemployment goes down, voluntary turnover goes up. And unemployment is very low right now. Voluntary turnover is very high. So organizations, many of them, are struggling with how to retain workers so that they're not moving to other companies. And, I know this is a little graphic, but, basically your employees don't want to wait for their boss to die. And if you don't provide career paths for them, their only choices are to sort of wait it out, which is not a great option, or to leave. And so if you can keep your employees from leaving your organization, the thing is that they already, theoretically, if they want to stay, they like the organization's vision and mission. They like the culture. It suits them. They like their commute. Commute is one of the reasons why employees will leave an organization. They probably have a friend at work, as you can see from Gallup's engagement surveys for some employees who want to stick around. So definitely think about focusing on all employees. Third recommendation is the one I mentioned earlier around holding leaders accountable for the number of internal moves, either with a carrot or a stick, and then start managing employee career paths as early as possible. One of the things I mentioned in terms of decreasing time to fill new roles, an organization that has a strong value proposition around moving talent will have an easier time attracting workers, especially those younger workers. Next one is to ensure communication is transparent and timely. If someone's applying for a job, think about letting them know why they didn't get it if they didn't get it. Just heard a great example from an organization yesterday. They're going to be training their recruiters to be career coaches as well, so that as people are looking for jobs, applying for things, if they're not getting them, the recruiters will then be able to provide advice to them about what they might need to do in order to get the skills they need for those roles. So obviously there's a linkage there between your learning and development team, but it's really important to start thinking about that, and that goes right into the next one around creating a cross-functional partnership within HR, that idea of a talent brokerage team across all the different functions. And then last but definitely not least, because this could be a big barrier, if you don't have the technology that supports those integrated end-to-end total talent mobility processes. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amy to go through our final slides, and we'll start to look at the questions that you might have and see if we can answer those for you.
Thank you so much, Robyn and Marian, for sharing the strategic purposes, barriers, and some best practices to achieve those strategic purposes. And as I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the webcast, we also created a summary table that captured all the 10 strategic purposes, the primary barriers to each, and the 3 best practices to help you overcome on some of the barriers. So it's also available on our website, so that you can download it and maybe paste it on your desk. So with that, these are all the findings that we'd like to share with you today, and we have some questions from our audience. Okay, so one of the questions came in while Robyn, you were talking about the enabling skills and competency development, but not to put you on the spot, and Marian, feel free to chime in as well. So could you share which of those talent competencies will be needed in the future, or is this data referenced in the talent mobility report?
All right, well, I'll take a shot, and then Marian, please jump in. So first of all, we're not psychics. We're not in that business. No crystal balls. However, there will be new skills required with new technologies. Just think about when ATMs were put in. Many people predicted the end of banking as we know it. We wouldn't need banking personnel anymore. But what happened is that those tellers whose job was no longer needed, they actually learned new skills, and now they are higher level. They interact more with the customers, and the very transactional, just getting money out, you can do from an ATM. So, and actually there are now more banks than there ever were before we had ATMs. So there's not more, but there's more people doing banking. So think about it from that perspective. So when you start to think about the skills that are needed, think about the technologies that are coming. I think one of the main competencies is going to be around data analytics and analysis. I think leaders especially, but also staff, need to become more comfortable with data. In fact, yesterday I was at a meeting, a council meeting here at the conference board, and was blown away. One of the companies had a dashboard that had 16 tabs in Excel that was updated monthly, and that's how complicated their dashboard was for talent acquisition. But clearly, the leaders need to know what to think of the data, and then start to think about using data predictively, not just compiling historical data, and the idea of thinking about how can we use this data in the future. To answer your question specifically, the data is not referenced in that style in the total talent mobility report. However, we do add some best practices in there, and you may be able to glean some findings from that. But Marian, do you have any other thoughts on which talent competencies besides data analytics and new AI skills, new technology skills will be needed in the future?
Yeah, I mean, some of the other research that we're doing at the conference board, I think that very definitely, as Robyn says, the digital and the analytical skills, and a lot of companies out there are trying to really define these. But the thing that I've heard as well is actually saying don't forget about soft skills, that those two techie skills are really, really, really important, but also I think human-based skills are not going to stop being important, and particularly the skills of communicating and collaborating. So some of what we might call soft skills, but if you are going to ask people to work in much more agile ways and in much more varied ways and across functions and all sorts of different teams, then I think having people that are really good communicators, really good team players, and really good at collaboration is going to be very, very important. And I think when it comes to sort of leaders, I think something that we're seeing is the message of, yes, digital skills, analytical skills, but also commercial understanding. I think everybody, no matter where they are in the organisation, what function they're in, as they get up, further up the organisation, they have to understand commercial, the language of the business, the financial hard ratios, etc. Nobody's immune, and I think that more and more organisations are looking to people to understand, what they're trying to achieve out there in the marketplace, and the bottom line. So I think that's what I would emphasise as well. And I think just finally, I went to a conference last week where we spoke a lot. There was a lot of speaking around AI and some of these things about augmenting humans. But I think a message that I heard very much was, and we need to understand increasingly what is human. And it is about creativity, it is about intuition, it is about responsiveness to other humans, and not to lose sight of that. And I think that's a really important message.
Very well said. Thank you, Robyn and Marian, for sharing your perspectives. And indeed, both technical and human skills are important for the future. And thanks, Gloria, for raising the question. So we are at the top of the hour, and unfortunately we're not able to cover all of your questions. Please contact us afterwards if you are interested in some of the areas. So our next Human Capital Watch will be held on July 17th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. It's based on a research study conducted by my colleagues Mary Young, Principal Researcher of Human Capital, and Patty Phillips, the Distinguished Principal Research Fellow of Human Capital with the Conference Board. So the topic is on navigating the landscape of learning analytics, preparing for what's next. So if you're interested, please register now. And for those of you who are interested in talent acquisition, also I have some good news for you. So our annual Talent Acquisition Conference will be held in New York, October 17th to 18th. And again, the topic is on future workforce, closing the gap. So we have 500 discount for you if you or your colleagues are interested in attending.
Amy, let me just jump in. I'll actually be speaking about artificial intelligence and talent acquisition there.
Great,
so,
thank you.
Just another plug.
We look forward to hearing your presentation. So thank you again to Marian and Robyn for sharing the research findings. I'd like to thank our audience for attending today's webcast as well. Please take a few minutes to fill out the evaluation at the end of the webcast, and we look forward to seeing you in the future. Thanks again. Bye.
Thank you.